And now, as our custom is, and we are going to have an offering sermonette to introduce the offering, and that will be given to us by Mr. DPlumley. And then when that's completed, we'll have the announcements from our minister, Mr. Gowdy. So over now to Mr. Plumley.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Bit of a chilly day out there. At least we haven't got any rain. Let's get myself organised. Okay. Well, recently I've been reading more of the two letters to the Corinthians. The first one we have in the Bible is actually Paul's second letter to them. We don't have a record of that previous letter. We don't have it recorded, I should say. But the first letter in the Bible sometimes refers back to it and refers back to subjects that Paul had raised in that earlier letter. The first letter that we do have was written in the period running up to this very season of the year. It covers many subjects, some of which are taken up yet again in Paul's third letter to them, the one we call 2 Corinthians. One of the subjects that are addressed from various angles in both letters of Corinthians, or to the Corinthians, is to do with giving and with contributing and with being a practical and functional part of the work that God is doing. For as long as we've been in the church, we've contributed in many ways to the work. We've contributed our time, our prayers, and of course our physical resources. And the Bible is clear that the financial aspect is certainly a part of our responsibility. A sizable part, for example, of the 9th chapter of the first book of Corinthians explains about not muzzling the ox, and that those who preach the gospel should be financially supported in doing so. And so there is an expectation that we are contributors to the work. And we've been enlisted, haven't we, to be involved. However, there's no contradiction between God expecting us to make offerings and our willingness and our desire to do so. The second letter to the Corinthians, or the third, whichever way you look at it, covers a wide range of subjects, such as the Corinthians' need to accept Paul's credentials as a minister. But have we ever noticed how Paul covers specific aspects of contributions and offerings in a number of different places in that letter? Even though Paul walks through the variety of topics in his letter, he sometimes weaves in, amongst those topics, guidance regarding their responsibility regarding contributions. And when we look at his choice of words and phrases, much of which we can't look into today, we'll look at just a few little bits, we can see that Paul is maybe using a bit of pressure as well to make his point. First, let's notice in chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, verse 13. A rather unusual sort of statement, really. So it's second book of Corinthians, or second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 12 and verse 13, where Paul says, "For in what way were you inferior to the other churches? Except it be that I was not burdensome to you. Forgive me this wrong." That's quite an unusual verse, isn't it? Okay, first of all, we need to understand what Paul means by burdensome. By burdensome, Paul is referring to him requiring them to financially support his work in the ministry. In a number of places in this second letter, you'll find the word burden used in that way. Not every case, but he lays it as a term meaning the requirement to support his work in the ministry. Now, Paul also uses a little bit of psychology because he asks, in what way were you inferior to the other churches? That's quite direct, isn't it? Inferior to the other churches. But then he puts the responsibility back on himself. He says this by saying, I myself was not burdensome to you. Forgive me this wrong. Now, what's he really saying there? I think he's saying, you may disagree, I think he's saying, I take the responsibility of not having made it clear what your responsibilities are. I haven't made it clear in the past where your responsibilities lie. That's my fault. But he doesn't remove the responsibility from them, does he? Earlier in this letter, Paul had brought to their attention the generosity of other congregations. I wonder why he did that. Let's look at a passage in chapter 8. So staying in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, where we'll see Paul uses some examples from the churches in Macedonia to make some points. And the language he uses, the choice of words, the phrasing, are all a form of guidance and a bit of course correction. So 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1. Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God, so that's an important starting point, bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. Notice the use of the word grace. God accepts us the example of giving. And in verse 2, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance, notice the choice of the word abundance, of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. It's all a bit old-fashioned English, but we can see what's being referred to there. Verse 3, for to their power I bear record, and beyond their power they were willing of themselves, praying us, verse 4, with much urgency that we should receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. In other words, they were eager to contribute. And Paul is setting the churches in Macedonia as an example. And verse 5, and they did this, not as we hoped, but first gave their own selves to the Lord and to us, two separate things. They gave to us as well. The same grace also. Now, the word grace comes up again. Verse 7, therefore, as you abound in everything, the Corinthians, it seems, had a bit of a propensity to boast. And Paul makes a point of this both in the first and second letters. As you abound in everything, in faith, in utterance, and in knowledge, and in all diligence, and in your love to us, see that you also abound in this grace also. He's making quite a pointed point. I think we can see that this time grace is referring to the expected contributions. Verse 8, I speak not by commandment, in other words, I'm not banging my fist down about this, but by occasion of the forwardness, in other words, the example of others, and to prove the sincerity of your love. He wants to see evidence of their involvement. Now, in chapter 11, moving forward 3 chapters, Paul makes it even clearer. Here we see that Paul is not only talking about taking up offerings to be collected for poor brethren in other areas, he specifically raises the subject of the support of him and his ministry. So 2 Corinthians, this time in chapter 11, starting in verse 7. Another strange statement. Did I commit sin in humbling myself? He's possibly there referring to the fact that he was supporting himself financially. And as we know, he was a tent maker and carried on that profession for a period of time at least. Did I commit sin in humbling myself, that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge? Getting a little bit more direct. In verse 8, I stripped other churches, taking wages for the serving of you. And being present with you, and in need, I was not a burden to anyone. You can see again the use of the word burden there. For the brothers from Macedonia made up completely for my needs, and in every way I have kept myself from being burdensome to you, and will keep myself. So he's really setting an example and yet taking the pressure off. He's letting the example make its own point, I think. So how was Paul expecting them to respond when he explained the generosity of the Macedonians? I think they would have got the point. It's clear that Paul was not only talking about offerings for the poor members, he was also talking of the collective responsibility to support the work and to support him. But did he leave it there? Only talking of responsibility, only making requirements or laying down the law? No, in a number of places he also addressed the attitude when giving. Now let's read parts of the passage we often do read on such days as this. We know so well those passages which sum up the very mind of God that we can have when contributing to his work. In this passage, Paul is talking in particular of their assistance for the needs of the saints, but the same approach, the same attitude applies to such opportunities as we have today when we take up an offering for the work. So we'll turn to that much quoted chapter, which is the one in between, chapter 9, and starting in verse 1. For indeed, regarding the ministry to the saints, it is not necessary for me to write to you. For I know your eagerness, of which I boast to the Macedonians on your behalf, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has aroused the greater number. Or, as it maybe should read, the majority of you. So it seems Paul was only addressing really a small number within that congregation. Verse 3, yet, or nevertheless, I sent the brothers, lest our boasting, which is on your behalf, should not be in vain, that, as I said, you may be ready. This matter of being prepared and ready. Verse 4, I say this in the case of the Macedonians should come with me and find, in case the Macedonians should come with me and find you unprepared. We, not to say you, would then be put to shame in this confident boasting. So Paul was saying, don't make me feel awkward by the fact that I've said how you're going to be and not for you not to follow through. So, verse 5, I thought it necessary to urge the brethren to go on ahead and to arrange in advance the gift you have promised, so that you may be ready as a willing gift, not as a grudging obligation. And verse 6, but I say this, he who sows sparingly shall also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully shall also reap bountifully. And verse 7, each one as he purposes in his heart. So it's very much an individual decision between us and God. Let him give, not of grief or of necessity. Now he's already covered that side of things, the necessity, but that's not the driving force. It's the attitude that God has, that we do this lovingly and cheerfully. So Paul's not saying there's no need. Their contribution was needed, but he hoped their approach was not merely giving under pressure. Paul continues by showing the example of God himself as we now close out in verse 8. And God is able to make all grace abound to you. Why? So you may abound in every good work. But notice who the author of that grace is, or that abounding. Verse 9. As it is written, he, God, has distributed freely in every way. And it's this generosity, of course, which enables us to be generous. And Paul ends with verse 15. Thanks be to God for his inexpressible gift. We'll take up the offering now, and while we're taking up the offering, we're going to hear Minuet in G minor by George Frederick Handel, played by Steve Robson on the piano.